The sky above the alien planet was a bruised shade of violet, streaked with faint veins of crimson lightning that never struck. The air carried an electric tang, sharp and metallic, as if the atmosphere itself bristled with hostility. Below this restless canopy stretched a landscape of jagged obsidian spires jutting from the ground like broken teeth. At their center loomed the Veil, a fortress so vast it seemed less constructed than grown, its black walls rippling faintly under the dim light of twin suns sinking into the horizon. It exuded silence, not the peaceful kind, but one heavy with anticipation, as though waiting for something or someone to disturb its slumber. Dr. Elara Voss stood at the edge of the landing site, her boots crunching softly against crystalline shards littering the ground. She pulled her coat tighter around her frame, though it wasn't cold. It was the weight of the place pressing down on her chest. Behind her, the battered exploration vessel hummed faintly, its engines cooling after the long journey from Earth's last colony. Her team moved about in quiet efficiency, unloading equipment and scanning the surroundings. But no amount of preparation could mask the unease etched into their faces. Elara had seen that look before, in the eyes of refugees fleeing flooded cities, in scientists scrambling to reverse engineer solutions too late to matter. She knew because she'd worn it herself when Earth fell apart. Guilt gnawed at her now, sharper than ever. Leaving behind those who couldn't afford passage off-world felt like abandoning ship while others drowned. And yet here she was, chasing shadows across the stars because humanity needed answers, even if they didn't deserve them. Her gaze lingered on Captain Rylan Dax, his broad shoulders tense as he barked orders to secure the perimeter. He trusted nothing, not the planet, not the mission, certainly not her. His skepticism wasn't unfounded. Every step forward came at a cost, and failure meant more lives lost. Still, his distrust grated on her nerves. Beside him, Kael crouched near a patch of bioluminescent moss, murmuring excitedly into a recorder. The linguist's enthusiasm bordered on reckless, but his fascination with alien cultures reminded Elara why they were out here in the first place. Discovery, hope, survival. Anything? Priya Malik asked, joining Elara by the edge of the clearing. Her voice was calm, steady, a counterpoint to the chaos swirling inside Elara's mind. As the team's lead engineer, Priya had spent weeks poring over scans of the Veil, searching for weaknesses or entry points. Now standing face to face with the monolith, even she looked small. "Not yet," Elara replied, forcing a smile. "But we'll find our way in." Priya tilted her head slightly, studying her. "You sound sure." "I have to be." It wasn't just bravado talking. Deep down, Elara believed in the resilience of humanity, the same stubbornness that drove people to rebuild after disasters, to reach for the stars despite countless failures. Yet doubt lingered, whispering that perhaps some things weren't meant to be found. What if the Veil wasn't a relic of knowledge, but a warning, a tomb? Before she could dwell further, Kael approached, holding up a fragment of stone etched with intricate carvings. "Look at this," he said, excitement bubbling beneath his words. "These symbols, they're unlike anything I've seen before. They might predate the Varnith themselves." Elara took the shard, running her fingers over the grooves. The patterns shifted subtly under her touch, almost imperceptibly alive. For a moment she swore she heard whispers, faint and indistinct, echoing in her mind. Shaking off the sensation, she handed it back to Kael. "Good work. Let's see what else you can dig up." As the team dispersed to continue their survey, Elara turned toward the Veil once more. Its surface shimmered faintly, refracting the dying sunlight into eerie hues. Something about it called to her, not with words, but with a pull deeper than logic. Whatever secrets lay within, they would change everything, for better or worse. Hours passed in a blur of activity. Scans revealed anomalies deep within the structure, energy signatures pulsing erratically, defying known physics. When the team regrouped near the ship, Rylan wasted no time voicing his concerns. "We shouldn't stay," he said bluntly, arms crossed. "This place isn't stable. We don't know what we're dealing with. And that's exactly why we need to investigate," Elara countered, meeting his glare head-on. "If there's even a chance the Veil holds technology or resources we can use—" "It's a death trap," Rylan interrupted. "Every instinct tells me to get us out of here." Elara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Then trust mine. Trust that we're stronger together than apart. If we leave now, we'll never know what's inside, and we'll lose whatever advantage it might give us." For a long moment, Rylan said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine, but if things go south, we follow my lead." Relief washed over Elara, though she kept her expression neutral. Turning back to the group, she outlined the plan: establish a base camp outside the Veil, send drones to map potential entrances, and prepare for a controlled breach. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Not yet. Night fell quickly, plunging the landscape into shadow. The team worked by the glow of portable lights, their movements illuminated in stark relief against the darkened terrain. Despite the precautions, unease settled over the camp like a fog. Equipment readings fluctuated wildly, sensors picking up phantom signals that vanished upon closer inspection. Even the air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Then came the signal. A burst of energy erupted from the Veil, bathing the camp in blinding light. Instinctively, everyone ducked, shielding their eyes. When the glare faded, the fortress stood unchanged, but something had awakened. Faint vibrations coursed through the ground, resonating in their bones. The carvings on the shard Kael had found earlier glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the makeshift shelter. "What the hell was that?" Rylan demanded, gripping his weapon tightly. Elara stared at the Veil, her heart pounding. Whatever they'd disturbed, it knew they were there, and it wasn't pleased. "This is it," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Our inciting incident." Without another word, she grabbed her gear and headed toward the fortress, the rest of the team reluctantly following. There was no turning back now. The entrance to the Veil loomed ahead, a jagged maw carved into the obsidian wall. Its edges shimmered faintly, as though coated in liquid mercury, and the air around it hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration. Elara hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her boots crunching softly against the crystalline ground. Behind her, the team exchanged uneasy glances, their breaths visible in the thin, cold atmosphere. None of them spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, like the oppressive twilight sky above. Kael broke the silence first, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. "This is it," he murmured, running his fingers over the glowing runes, etched into the stone frame. "These symbols, they're not just decorative, they're instructions." Elara glanced at him sharply. "Instructions for what?" "For entering," Kael replied, his eyes wide behind his visor. I think we're supposed to activate them." Rylan stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the weapon strapped to his side. "You're telling me this thing has a doorbell? Great. Let's ring it and see who answers." "It's not that simple," Kael shot back, irritation cutting through his usual enthusiasm. "If these are activation sequences, they could trigger anything. Defenses, traps, or worse." "Or nothing," Rylan countered, his tone dripping with skepticism. "We don't even know if this place is still operational. For all we know, it's just a big rock." Elara held up a hand, silencing both men. "Enough. We came here to investigate, not argue." She turned to Kael. "Can you decipher them?" Kael hesitated, his gaze flickering between the runes and the dark abyss beyond the threshold. "Maybe, but it'll take time. And there's no guarantee I won't make things worse." Priya stepped closer, her expression calm but resolute. Then let's minimize risks. Set up a perimeter and monitor the readings while you work. If anything changes, we pull back immediately." Elara nodded. "Agreed. Everyone stay alert." As Kael knelt by the entrance, his hands hovering over the glowing symbols, the rest of the team fanned out, setting up portable scanners and defensive drones. The tension was palpable, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the eerie stillness broken only by the faint hum emanating from the fortress. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Kael muttered under his breath, tracing patterns with his fingertips as the runes responded sluggishly, pulsing brighter with each touch. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled slightly, though whether from fear or concentration was unclear. Finally, with a soft click that echoed unnaturally loud in the silence, the entrance began to shift. The obsidian walls parted slowly, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in dim, greenish light. The air inside was colder, heavier, carrying a metallic tang that made Elara's skin prickle. She exchanged a glance with Rylan, whose grip on his weapon tightened reflexively. Priya adjusted her scanner, her brow furrowed as the readings spiked erratically. "Well," Rylan said dryly, "that wasn't ominous at all." Ignoring him, Elara took a cautious step forward, her boots clicking against the smooth glass-like floor. The others followed, their footsteps echoing. Unnaturally in the confined space, the corridor twisted and turned unpredictably, defying logic as if designed to disorient intruders. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by unseen sources of light, and the faint hum grew louder, almost musical. "In its cadence. This isn't natural," Priya whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. "It's alive." Before anyone could respond, the walls shuddered violently, throwing them off balance. A low rumble reverberated through the corridor, accompanied by a series of sharp clicks and whirs. The lights flickered, plunging the group into near darkness before stabilizing again. When the illumination returned, the corridor had changed. The path behind them was gone, sealed off by solid walls. "What the hell?" Rylan barked, spinning around to face the obstruction. "We're trapped!" "No," Elara said firmly, though her heart raced. "Not yet. There has to be another way out." Kael pointed ahead, his face pale. "There! Look!" At the end of the corridor, a massive chamber opened up, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood a towering structure, a spire of black crystal pulsating with energy. Surrounding it were dozens of humanoid figures, frozen mid-motion, their bodies encased in translucent, amber-like material. Their faces were contorted in expressions of terror, their eyes wide and unseeing. "The Varnith," Kael breathed, awe mingling with dread in his voice. "They didn't abandon this place. They were trapped here." Elara approached cautiously, her mind racing. These weren't just statues or relics, they were warnings. Each figure seemed to tell a story, their poses suggesting desperation, betrayal, despair. One figure clutched a device similar to the shard Kael had found earlier, its surface cracked and darkened. Another reached toward the spire, as if trying to stop something or someone from reaching it. "These aren't prisoners," Priya said quietly, her voice tinged with horror. "They're sacrifices." Rylan swore under his breath, his weapon raised. Sacrifices to what? Before anyone could answer, the spire emitted a low, resonant tone, vibrating through the chamber like a heartbeat. The amber casings around the figures began to crack, releasing wisps of shadowy mist that coalesced into amorphous shapes. The shapes writhed and twisted, forming vague humanoid outlines before dissolving into the air. "What the hell is that?" Rylan demanded, backing away. Elara's throat tightened as realization dawned. "The Devourer," she whispered. "It's feeding on their fear." The shadows surged toward the group, moving impossibly fast. Instinctively, Elara grabbed Kael's arm and pulled him back, shouting for the others to retreat. The team scrambled toward the corridor they'd entered through, but the walls shifted again, sealing off their escape route. Panic set in as the shadows closed in, their forms flickering with distorted images of the team's worst fears. For Elara, it was earth burning, cities crumbling into ash as people screamed for help. For Rylan, it was the faces of his crewmates turning on him, accusing him of betrayal. For Priya, it was the memory of losing her family during the exodus from Earth, their cries fading into silence. And for Kael, it was the knowledge that every discovery he made would lead to destruction, no matter how noble his intentions. "We can't fight it," Elara shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "It thrives on our fear. We have to." Focus. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to confront the vision of Earth's demise. The flames receded, replaced by a memory of hope, a child planting a tree in the ruins of a city, symbolizing humanity's resilience. Slowly, the shadow faltered, retreating from her. Encouraged, she turned to the others, urging them to do the same. One by one, they fought back against their nightmares, drawing strength from each other. The shadows wavered, their forms destabilizing until they dissolved entirely. The chamber fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the survivors. "That shouldn't have worked," Priya said finally, her voice shaky but steady. "What did you do?" "I reminded myself of who we are," Elara replied, her gaze fixed on the spire, "and what we're capable of." But the victory was short-lived. As they regrouped, the spire pulsed once more, emitting a deafening screech that sent them stumbling backward. The ground beneath their feet began to crack, revealing veins of glowing energy that spread outward like roots. The fortress was waking. "Up, and it wasn't pleased. We need to move," Rylan growled, already heading toward the nearest exit. "Now!" Elara hesitated, torn between curiosity and survival. Finally, she nodded, following the others as the chamber collapsed behind them. The fortress was alive, intelligent, and dangerous, but it also held answers. Answers they needed to survive. As they fled deeper into the veil, the stakes became clearer than ever. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a test. One. Humanity might not pass. The fortress seemed alive in ways that defied comprehension. Its corridors twisted and shifted unpredictably, as though it were reshaping itself to confound intruders. The walls pulsed faintly with an inner light, casting eerie shadows that danced unnaturally across the group's path. Every step forward felt like walking through quicksand, each movement resisted by an unseen force that pressed against their chests, making breathing laborious. Elara led the way, her mind racing faster than her feet. She could feel the weight of the veil pressing down on them, not just physically but mentally, probing for cracks in their resolve. Behind her, Kael muttered under his breath, clutching the shard he'd found earlier. His knuckles were white, his eyes darting between the glowing symbols etched into the walls and the dark recesses of the corridor. "This place, it's testing us," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Every turn, every trap, it's designed to break us. And yet here we are," Rylan snapped, his weapon raised and scanning the darkness ahead. Still standing, still breathing. But for how long? Priya adjusted the settings on her scanner, her brow furrowed in concentration. Energy readings are spiking again. Whatever's powering this place is waking up, and it doesn't seem happy about visitors. Elara didn't respond immediately. Her thoughts churned with questions she couldn't answer. What had the Varnith created here? Why had they sealed themselves inside, only to be consumed by whatever lurked within? And most importantly, what did it want from them now? As if in response to her unspoken queries, the corridor widened abruptly, revealing another chamber bathed in flickering red light. At its center stood a massive obelisk, its surface covered in intricate carvings that shimmered like liquid metal. Unlike the previous spire, this one radiated warmth rather than cold, an invitation rather than a threat. But something about it felt wrong, as though it were luring them closer with promises too tempting to resist. "This is new," Priya observed, lowering her scanner. "Different energy signature, more organic." "Organic?" Rylan echoed, his tone sharp with disbelief. "You mean like some kind of alien parasite waiting to infect us?" "No," Elara interjected, stepping toward the obelisk. "More like consciousness." She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface. Instantly, images flooded her mind, visions of towering cities, vast oceans, and skies filled with unfamiliar constellations. Then came the darker visions, wars fought over resources, civilizations collapsing under their own hubris, and finally, the creation of the Veil itself, a desperate attempt to contain something far greater than the Varnith had anticipated. She staggered back, gasping for air as the visions faded. "It's not just a prison," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's a mirror, a reflection of everything we've done and everything we're capable of doing." Kael frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" "The Devourer," Elara explained, struggling to steady herself. "It's not just some alien entity, it's part of them, part of us, born from fear, greed, and destruction. They tried to lock it away, but it grew stronger, feeding on their despair until there was nothing left." Priya's expression darkened. "So what happens when it gets loose?" Before anyone could answer, the obelisk emitted a low hum, vibrating beneath their fingertips. The carvings began to shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns that glowed brighter with each passing second. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them cracked open, sending them tumbling into a hidden chamber below. When the dust settled, they found themselves surrounded by rows of crystalline pods, each containing a preserved body suspended in translucent fluid. Unlike the amber-encased figures they'd seen earlier, these bodies appeared intact, their faces serene as though caught mid-dream. Monitors attached to the pods displayed fluctuating vitals, suggesting life, or at least something resembling it. "They're still alive," Kael breathed, awe mingling with dread in his voice. "Or something close to it." Rylan swore under his breath, raising his weapon instinctively. "Alive or not, they're part of this mess. We should destroy them before they wake up." "No!" Elara shouted, stepping between him and the nearest pod. "We don't know what they are, or what they might teach us. Destroying them would be no different than what the Varnith did." "And look where that got them," Rylan countered, his voice rising. "Dead, trapped in their own nightmare. Is that what you want for us?" The argument escalated quickly, voices echoing off the chamber walls until Priya intervened, her tone sharp and commanding. "Enough! Fighting among ourselves is exactly what this place wants. If we let it divide us, we're already lost." Her words cut through the tension, forcing both sides to pause. Elara took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. She's right. We can't afford to fall apart. Not now. But the momentary truce was shattered when one of the pods began to crack. Fluid spilled onto the floor as the figure inside stirred, its eyes fluttering open. It was humanoid, but distinctly alien, its skin pale and translucent, veins glowing faintly beneath the surface. When it spoke, its voice resonated in their minds rather than their ears. "You have awakened me," it said, its tone calm, but tinged with sorrow. "And in doing so, you have doomed yourselves." Elara stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" "I am the last of my kind," the figure replied, sitting upright in the remains of its pod. "A guardian of the Veil, and a prisoner of my own design." "What do you mean?" Kael asked, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The figure turned its gaze toward him, its eyes glowing faintly. "Long ago we sought to create perfection, to harness the power of artificial consciousness and transcend our limitations. But in our arrogance, we unleashed something beyond our control. Something born not of flesh, but of thought, fear, despair. Hubris, it consumed us, feeding on the very emotions we sought to master. The Devourer, Elara murmured, realization dawning. Yes, the figure confirmed. And now it knows you are here. It will come for you, as it came for us. Rylan tightened his grip on his weapon. Then tell us how to stop it. The figure shook its head slowly. You cannot stop it. You can only delay the inevitable. But perhaps... It paused, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. Perhaps you can learn from our mistakes. Before anyone could press further, alarms blared throughout the chamber, accompanied by the sound of shifting walls. The fortress was collapsing around them, forcing them to flee once more. As they ran, the figure's final words echoed in their minds. Trust nothing, not even yourselves. The escape route led them deeper into the labyrinthine structure, where the air grew colder and the shadows thicker. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the fortress itself were resisting their presence. Along the way, they encountered remnants of the Varnith civilization, holographic records depicting their rise and fall, artifacts hinting at advanced technology, and warnings scrawled in desperate handwriting. One message stood out above the rest: do not awaken the hunger. What does that even mean? Kael asked, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the fortress. It means we're running out of time, Elara replied grimly. Whatever. The hunger it's coming. Her prediction proved true moments later when the walls began to bleed shadowy tendrils that coalesced into familiar forms. The same amorphous shapes they'd encountered earlier, only larger and more menacing. This time, however, the shadows didn't attack directly. Instead, they whispered, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair. You cannot win, one voice hissed, mimicking Rylan's tone. You'll abandon them just like before. You're weak, another sneered, echoing Kael's insecurities. Your curiosity will kill you all. You failed them, a third taunted, replaying Elara's guilt over leaving Earth behind, just like you failed everyone else. The psychological assault was relentless, driving wedges between the team members as old wounds reopened. Rylan accused Elara of leading them to their deaths, while Kael retreated into himself, muttering apologies to no one in particular. Even Priya, usually the voice of reason, struggled to maintain composure as memories of her family's loss resurfaced. We don't keep fighting it alone, Elara said finally, her voice breaking through the chaos. We need to trust each other, or none of us will make it out alive. Her words struck a chord. Slowly, painfully, the team regrouped, drawing strength from their shared determination. Together, they pushed forward, navigating traps and illusions, until they reached a massive chamber dominated by a pulsating core, the source of the Veil's power and likely the key to stopping the Devourer. This is it, Priya said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into her features. If we disable the core, we might be able to collapse the fortress and trap the Devourer inside. But at what cost? Kael asked, his gaze fixed on the core. What if we unleash something worse? There's no guarantee either way, Elara admitted, but staying here isn't an option. As they prepared to act, Rylan pulled her aside, his expression unusually vulnerable. If this goes south, I just want you to know, I'm sorry for doubting you. Elara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Thank you. That means more than you know. With no time left for hesitation, they executed their plan. Priya worked tirelessly to reroute the core's systems, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the tremors shaking the chamber. Meanwhile, Elara and Kael kept watch, fending off waves of shadowy entities that surged toward them, with increasing ferocity. Finally, Priya gave the signal. I've stabilized the core. But someone needs to stay behind to ensure the process completes. Otherwise, it'll destabilize and release the Devourer. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, without hesitation, Priya stepped forward. "I'll do it." "No!" Elara protested, grabbing her arm. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Priya replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "This is my choice. Trust me, I've made peace with it." Before anyone could argue further, she activated the override sequence, sealing herself inside the chamber. The doors slammed shut, cutting her off from the others. Through the reinforced glass, they watched as she worked feverishly, her expression calm despite the tears streaming down her face. "Go!" she shouted, her voice muffled but clear. "Now!" Reluctantly, the remaining three fled, retracing their steps as the fortress began to collapse around them. Explosions rocked the structure, sending debris raining down as they sprinted toward the exit. Behind them, the core detonated in a blinding flash of light, shaking the ground violently. When they emerged into the twilight sky, gasping for air, the fortress was gone, reduced to rubble. But as they stared at the wreckage, a single question lingered in their minds. Had they truly contained the Devourer or merely delayed its return? The fortress was gone, but the air around them still vibrated with residual energy, as though the planet itself were mourning its loss, or warning of what was to come. Elara stood at the edge of the crater where the veil had once loomed, her chest heaving from exertion and grief. Her hands trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of Priya's sacrifice. Behind her, Kael knelt on the ground, his head bowed, muttering fragments of prayers or apologies under his breath. Rylan paced back and forth, his weapon drawn, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. "She shouldn't have stayed," Kael whispered finally, his voice cracking. "We could have found another way." "There wasn't another way," Elara replied, her tone firm despite the ache in her throat. "She knew that, and she chose to save us, all of us." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp with unshed tears. "Don't let her choice be in vain." Rylan stopped pacing, his expression grim. "You think it's over, that thing, whatever it is. It doesn't strike me as something you can just blow up and walk away from." Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared into the crater, her mind racing. The core had detonated, collapsing the fortress and sealing off the Devourer. Or so they hoped. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only delayed the inevitable. The Varnith had tried containment, and look where that had gotten them. Was humanity truly any different? Before anyone could speak further, the ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. A low, guttural growl echoed through the air, resonating not in their ears but in their bones. Slowly, they turned toward the source of the sound, a swirling vortex of shadow and light emerging from the ruins of the Veil. It pulsed erratically, growing larger with each passing second, until it towered above them like a living storm. "It's here," Kael breathed, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. "No," Elara corrected, her gaze locked onto the entity. "It's been here all along. We just gave it a reason to show itself." The Devourer took shape slowly, its form shifting between recognizable silhouettes and abstract horrors. At times it resembled the Varnith, their faces twisted in agony. Other times it mirrored humanity's darkest moments, war-torn cities, starving children, ecological collapse. But most terrifying of all was when it assumed no form at all, becoming an endless void that seemed to stretch into infinity. "What do we do?" Rylan demanded, raising his weapon despite knowing it would be useless against such a foe. "We fight," Elara said simply, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Not with weapons, but with unity. It feeds on division, despair, and fear. If we stand together, maybe we can weaken it enough to seal it again. And if we can't, Kael asked, his voice trembling. "Then we go down fighting," Elara replied, her resolve hardening. "For Priya, for Earth, for everyone who's ever counted on us to make things right." With that, she stepped forward, her boots crunching, softly against the crystalline shards littering the ground. The others followed reluctantly, forming a loose triangle around her as they faced the encroaching darkness. As they moved closer, the entity responded, sending tendrils of shadow snaking toward them. Each tendril carried fragments of their worst fears, their failures, regrets, and doubts manifested into tangible forms. Elara braced herself as one of the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her ankle and pulling her toward the vortex. Images flooded her mind, Earth burning, her family screaming for help, the faces of those she'd failed accusing her of betrayal. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus on the present moment, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of her teammates' voices, the memory of Priya's final smile. Slowly, the tendril loosened its grip, dissolving into smoke. "Stay focused!" she shouted, turning to see Rylan grappling with another tendril that had coiled around his arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as visions of his crewmates turning on him played out before him. "Rylan, you're stronger than this." He hesitated, then nodded, gritting his teeth as he forced himself to confront the illusion. With a shout, he broke free, stumbling backward but still standing. Kael wasn't faring much better. Shadows swarmed around him, whispering accusations of hubris and destruction. "You did this," they hissed. "Your curiosity killed them all." "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I wanted to understand, to learn, to help," Elara finished, stepping closer to him. "That's why we're here, not because we're perfect, but because we refuse to give up." Her words seemed to anchor him, giving him the strength to push back against the shadows. Together, the three formed a tight circle, their backs pressed against each other as the entity closed in around them. "This isn't working," Rylan growled, firing futile shots into the vortex. "We need a plan, something bigger than this." Elara's mind raced, searching for inspiration. Then she remembered the obelisk, the Guardian's warning about learning from the Varnith's mistakes. What if the key wasn't destruction, but connection, understanding? Risky as it was, it might be their only chance. "We need to connect with it," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "To show it that we're more than our fears, more than our failures. You want us to talk to it?" Kael asked incredulously. "Yes," Elara replied, her gaze unwavering, "but not with words, with actions, with trust." Without waiting for agreement, she reached out, placing her hand directly into the swirling mass of shadows. Pain shot through her arm, cold and searing at the same time as images assaulted her mind. The Varnith's experiments, their desperation, their ultimate downfall. But beneath the pain, she felt something else, a flicker of recognition, of curiosity. The Devourer wasn't just a mindless predator. It was a fragment of creation gone wrong, a reflection of every civilization's capacity for self-destruction. Slowly, carefully, she extended her thoughts outward, focusing not on fear but on hope, on resilience, on humanity's ability to rebuild, to adapt, to survive even in the face of unimaginable odds. Around her, Rylan and Kael followed suit, reaching out with their own hands and minds, channeling their collective strength into a single unified force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a deafening roar, the vortex began to shrink, the shadows retreating into its core. The Devourer resisted, thrashing wildly as if trying to break free. But the bond between the three humans held firm, bolstered by their shared determination. Finally, with a blinding flash of light, the entity collapsed inward, vanishing completely. The ground stilled, the air clearing as the oppressive weight lifted. For the first time since entering the veil, they could breathe freely. Exhausted, the trio sank to their knees, staring at the empty space where the Devourer had stood. They had won, but at what cost? And how long would their victory last? The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive hum of the Veil's energy was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that stretched across the desolate landscape like a shroud. Elara sat on the jagged ground, her legs trembling beneath her as she tried to process what had just happened. Her hands were raw and blistered from touching the vortex, but the pain felt distant, almost inconsequential compared to the weight pressing down on her chest. Beside her, Kael stared blankly at the horizon, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Rylan leaned heavily against a shard of obsidian, his weapon resting uselessly at his side. "We did it," Kael murmured finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Didn't we?" Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced back, at the crater where the Veil had once stood. Its ruins smouldered faintly, wisps of smoke curling into the twilight sky. The Devourer was gone, for now. But the cost of their victory lingered in the air like ash. Priya's sacrifice weighed, heaviest of all, a reminder that survival often came at a price. "And too steep to measure, did we?" Rylan countered, his tone sharp with skepticism. "Or did we just buy ourselves some time? That thing, it wasn't just some alien parasite, it was part of them, part of us." Elara nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He's right. The Devourer wasn't born out of nothing. It came from fear, greed, hubris. Everything the Varnith created, everything we've done. It's all connected." Kael frowned, turning to face her. "So what? Does that mean that we're doomed to repeat their mistakes?" "No," Elara replied firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "It means we have a choice. We can either learn from this or let history consume us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. None of them spoke for a long moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Rylan broke the silence, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Priya believed in us. She gave her life because she thought we could make a difference. If we don't honor that, if we don't try to change things, then what was the point of any of this?" Elara met his gaze, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. For all his cynicism, Rylan carried the same burden they all did. The need to believe that humanity's flaws weren't insurmountable, that redemption was possible. "She trusted us," Kael added quietly, clutching the shard he'd found earlier. "And maybe that's enough to start with." As the suns dipped below the horizon, casting the planet in shadow, the trio began the slow journey back to their ship. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from physical exhaustion, but from the knowledge that their actions would ripple far beyond this moment. News of the Veil and the Devourer would spread across human colonies, sparking debates about exploration, ethics, and the limits of ambition. Some would see their mission as proof of humanity's resilience. Others would view it as a cautionary tale. When they reached the vessel, its battered hull gleamed faintly under the dim light of the twin moons. Inside, the cockpit was eerily quiet, the hum of its systems a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind. As they prepared for departure, Elara took one last look at the planet through the viewport. Its jagged spires and endless twilight seemed less menacing now, almost peaceful. But she knew better than to trust appearances. Hours later, as the ship broke orbit and entered the cold expanse of space, Elara retreated to her quarters. She pulled out her journal, flipping through pages filled with notes, sketches, and fragments of thoughts. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote a single sentence: "Survival isn't enough. To endure is to adapt, to grow." She paused, pen hovering over the paper as memories of Priya flooded her mind, of her calm determination, her unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away, forcing herself to focus. Writing wasn't just catharsis, it was a promise, a vow to carry forward the lessons they'd learned, no matter how painful or incomplete. By the time they reached the nearest colony, a sprawling orbital station orbiting a dying star, the story of the Veil had already begun to spread. Reports of their discovery sparked both awe and outrage, with factions arguing over whether humanity should continue exploring alien ruins or leave them untouched. Elara addressed the council personally, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched into her features. The Veil wasn't just a fortress, she explained, standing before a room full of skeptical faces. It was a mirror, a reflection of our potential for creation and destruction. What we choose to do with that knowledge will define us, not just as individuals, but as a species. Her words resonated with some, earning nods of approval, while others dismissed her as naive or reckless. But Elara didn't care. She hadn't come here seeking validation. She'd come to share the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. In the weeks that followed, life aboard the colony settled into a fragile routine. Supplies were rationed, repairs made, plans drawn up for future missions. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Rumors circulated about strange energy readings detected near other uncharted systems, whispers of something ancient and malevolent stirring in the void. Whether these reports were true or mere paranoia remained unclear, but Elara couldn't shake the feeling that the Devourer's influence hadn't been fully contained. One evening, as she walked along the station's observation deck, she found Kael staring out at the stars. His expression was unreadable, his hands clasped tightly around the shard he'd kept from the Veil. Without looking at her, he spoke. "I keep thinking about what the Guardian said, about learning from their mistakes. But how do we even begin to do that? How do we know we're not making new ones?" Elara joined him at the window, her reflection ghostly against the vastness of space. "We don't," she admitted softly. "But ignorance isn't an excuse, neither is fear. All we can do is try, and hope that trying is enough." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content to simply exist in the shared silence. Then Kael turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you think we'll ever really understand what happened down there, or why it chose us?" Elara shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Probably not, but maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe it's about asking the questions, even when the answers scare us." As they stood there, watching the stars twinkle like distant promises, a faint signal flickered on the station's monitors. It was weak, erratic, but unmistakably artificial. Originating from a system far beyond their current reach, Elara felt a chill run down her spine, though whether from dread or excitement she couldn't say. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: humanity's journey was far from over. The signal pulsed faintly on the station's monitors, its origin obscured by layers of static and interference. Technicians scrambled to triangulate its source, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of their screens. To most, it was just another anomaly, a curiosity to be logged and forgotten amidst the endless stream of data pouring in from the void. But Elara knew better. She stood in the observation deck once more, her gaze fixed on the distant stars as the signal flickered like a heartbeat. It wasn't random. She could feel it in her bones. Whatever had sent it wasn't reaching out blindly. It was calling, and though logic screamed at her to ignore it, something deeper compelled her to listen. Kael approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the hum of the station's systems. He held the shard tightly in one hand, its surface now dull and lifeless, compared to when they'd first found it within the Veil. "You think it's connected?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elara didn't turn to face him. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched or tested." She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. Maybe both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. the weight of unspoken fears hanging heavy between them. They had survived the veil, but survival wasn't the same as victory. The Devourer had been contained, for now, but its essence lingered, not just in the ruins of the fortress, but in the minds of those who had faced it. Elara still woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of shadowy tendrils reaching for her. Kael muttered in his sleep, fragments of alien languages spilling from his lips like prayers or curses. Even Rylan, ever stoic, carried himself differently now, his usual bravado tempered by an edge of quiet unease. Yet despite the scars, physical and otherwise, they couldn't deny the pull of the unknown. Humanity had always been driven by curiosity, by the need to explore and understand. It was what had brought them here, to the edge of the galaxy, chasing whispers of civilizations long dead. And it was what would drive them forward, no matter the cost. The Council debated endlessly about whether to investigate the signal. Some argued that humanity couldn't afford another reckless expedition, not after the losses incurred during their encounter with the Veil. Others insisted that ignoring such a discovery would be tantamount to surrender, a betrayal of everything they stood for. In the end, the decision fell to Elara. She spent hours alone in her quarters, staring at the shard Kael had left on her desk. Its carvings seemed darker now, almost faded, as if whatever power it had once held had been drained away. Yet when she touched it, she felt a faint pulse beneath her fingertips, a reminder of the choices they'd made and the lives they'd lost. Finally, she made her decision. Standing before the Council once more, she spoke with a clarity that silenced even the harshest critics. "We came here seeking answers," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Instead, we found questions. Questions about who we are, what we're capable of, and where we're headed. Ignoring this signal won't change that. Running won't protect us. If anything, it will make us weaker." Her words hung in the air, met with a mixture of awe and apprehension. When the vote was cast, the outcome was unanimous. They would send a new expedition to investigate the signal. This time, however, they wouldn't go unprepared. Lessons learned from the Veil would shape every aspect of the mission, from the technology they developed to the psychological training required for the crew. As preparations began, Elara retreated to the observation deck one final time. She stared out at the stars, her mind drifting back to Priya's sacrifice, to the faces of the Varnith frozen in amber, to the endless hunger of the Devourer. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of light, something waited. Something ancient, something alive, and humanity would answer its call, not because they were ready, but because they had no other choice. The last thing she wrote in her journal before sealing it shut was simple yet profound. To survive is human. To endure is divine. With that, she turned away from the window, stepping into the uncertain future ahead. The stars beckoned, their light both beautiful and cruel. Humanity had faced its reflection once before, and emerged scarred but unbowed. Now they would face it again. Whatever awaited them, they would meet it together.